Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
Operation on the King, we read, and knew how ill he was. But now the King is dead. The Princess Elizabeth has agreed to accept the crown and rule as Queen.
Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, ascended to the throne and was crowned Queen at the tender age of 27. Since that historic day, Her Majesty has worked with over a dozen prime ministers who have formed successive governments on her behalf. Her very first, the formidable Sir Winston Churchill, a true wartime hero, had inspired determination and courage throughout the empire and led Britain to victory in World War II. With age comes experience, but would his traditional views and tactics cause friction in his relationship with the modern monarch?
I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
The people had chosen Winston Churchill as their prime minister.
Britain was a world power. When statesmen like Winston Churchill talked, nations listened.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be.
He has been a great Parliament man. He loved the place, and the place loved him.
War is full of mysteries and surprises.
Sir Winston Churchill, Her Majesty's first Prime Minister. The relationship between the sovereign and the government and her prime minister is somewhat complex and not always easy to understand. As head of state, the Queen must remain entirely neutral with respect to political matters and must be seen to do so. The Queen does not vote nor stand for election. However, she does have vitally important ceremonial and formal roles and responsibilities concerning the government of the United Kingdom. The British legislature comprises of the Sovereign, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons.
Queen Elizabeth rides in state to open the new session of Parliament. Not since Victoria's Day has a reigning queen presided at the ceremony, and a huge crowd turns out to hail the young sovereign.
One of the Queen's duties is to open each new session of Parliament, announcing to the nation the agenda for her government for that term. The Queen also has a very special working and private relationship with her prime ministers, and none more so than with her first prime minister, Sir Winston Churchill. Her Majesty retains the right to appoint her prime minister and also to meet with them on a regular basis. Those private weekly meetings have offered great solace to some prime ministers, each of whom has honored the absolute confidentiality of these informal talks, but each of whom has also acknowledged the personal support they have felt in what must often be a lonely position of responsibility. So how did the young Winston Churchill grow up to become the Queen's first Prime Minister and her faithful, trusted, and valued advisor? Churchill's journey to becoming the Queen's first Prime Minister took him through an extraordinary and fascinating life, dogged by family turmoil, early financial hardship, and all the rigor and challenges of 2 world wars. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire in 1874 into an Old English aristocratic family. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was himself a member of Parliament and a respected statesman, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, daughter of a successful and wealthy businessman and a popular socialite, was originally from the United States. Churchill's early education years did not cover him in glory. He struggled at school and was noted for his relatively poor academic performance, as well as his challenging behavior. But when his creative side blossomed and his confidence grew, he eventually passed the entrance exam to Harrow School. Later, after a number of failed attempts, Churchill was finally admitted to Sandhurst, the Royal British Military Academy, where he thrived, and he subsequently served as an officer in the British Army.
One of the greatest statesmen and students of military tactics that Great Britain had ever known was a man who in his early years found himself unable to pass a Greek exam. This failure sent Winston Churchill to Sandhurst and military schooling instead of Oxford as his illustrious father before him.
However, Churchill's pen was calling him, and his love for words and the richness of the English language drew him into a career as a writer. Having failed in his first attempt at gaining a Conservative seat in Parliament through a by-election in Oldham, Winston took up his career as a writer. To achieve his political ambition, he needed fame and, of course, the necessary financial wherewithal. His strategy was to request postings to as many dangerous places in the world as he could, and to then write about them in newspapers and books, presenting himself as a hero and communicator. He traveled to South Africa, reporting on the Boer War for the Morning Post. He was shot at in Cuba. He fought on the Afghan border, and he faced a cavalry charge in the Sudan. His most famous headlines were made when he escaped Boer captivity from a military prison in South Africa.
Churchill first took his seat as an elected representative in the House of Commons in 1900. From then on, he was to leave his mark on history both at home and abroad.
Churchill returned to Britain and once again stood for Parliament in the general election of 1900, winning a Conservative seat in Oldham by a small margin and becoming a Member of Parliament for the first time. He quickly became a distinctive character in the House of Commons, seemingly devoid of inhibition and fearless in his quest to persuade others to his viewpoint. More than anything else, he was exceptional in delivering pre-prepared written speeches rather than improvised narrative. And as a natural writer and public speaker, his words carried great strength. In 1904, he crossed the floor and joined the British Liberal Party. After a 6-month courtship, Churchill's 56-year marriage to his devoted and loving wife, Clementine, started in 1908. Winston and the young Clementine Hosier had first met in 1904 at a lavish country house ball, but they did not get to know each other until they were seated together at a formal dinner in 1908. Churchill records being captivated by Clementine's intelligence and beauty. Clemmy became one of Churchill's greatest supporters. Together, they would find solutions to some of the most significant challenges he would face. In 1909, they had their first child, Diana Spencer Churchill, and had 4 further children, one of whom died at only 2 years of age, sending Winston into a deep and lasting bout of depression.
In World War I, he served as First Lord of the Admiralty and conceived the plan for breaching the Dardanelles. History has vindicated his part in the British disaster that followed and placed the blame instead on the War Office. From then on, the indomitable bulldog spirit was to carry the English leader through a succession of triumphs against the most overwhelming odds imaginable.
After the First World War, he then crossed the floor again, rejoining the Conservative Party, and served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, where he pushed for a policy of returning to the gold standard, a sometimes controversial decision which was greeted with somewhat mixed reaction. He lost that post when the Conservatives were defeated in the general election of 1929. Whilst not necessarily popular with his Conservative colleagues at the time, He became very popular and well known in Britain, much of which was due to his journalism and writing. In 1940, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned, and his hope was for Lord Halifax to step into his shoes, but Halifax declined. It was Churchill's time. He became the King's Prime Minister in May 1940, the very day the German forces attacked French soil. To say he had a challenging introduction to the job of Prime Minister would be a major understatement.
At the outbreak of the Second Great War in 1939, Sir Winston again answered his country's call as First Lord of the Admiralty. A year later, after the British defeat in Norway, he was drafted into the supreme command of the Empire's war effort as Prime Minister. 3 days after his appointment, he was to make his now famous inspirational speech that moved the entire free world with its simplicity and meaning.
I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Churchill's attack was through his eloquence in his speech and writing. When weaponry and resources were limited, it was his high-impact speeches that rallied Britons to believe they could win the war. He would come to epitomize the very essence of Britain's wartime spirit as a passionate patriot and with complete devotion to the British Empire and to the Queen's father, King George VI. Churchill thrived on what remains as one of Britain's greatest challenges in history, World War II.
What tragedies, what horrors, what crimes has Hitler and all that Hitler stands for brought upon Europe?
The very basis on which a prime minister is chosen is that they can command confidence in their administration, and there is little doubt of Churchill's ability to lead and to unite the nation.
Through his efforts, a closer relationship between the Allied countries was brought about, a condition that without a doubt was one of the main factors contributing to the speeded-up victory in World War II.
A coalition government was formed with a war cabinet including Chamberlain and Halifax. As Prime Minister, Churchill also appointed himself Minister of Defense. Shortly after Churchill became Prime Minister, he gave one of his most famous speeches, Their Finest Hour.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Germany wanted to invade Great Britain, and in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain commenced in the skies over southern England. In August, another of Churchill's timeless speeches said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Just a month later, the Royal Air Force fought the German Luftwaffe with resounding success, destroying a considerable formation of invading aircraft. This unexpected defeat for Hitler caused him to make a fatal tactical error and to delay his plans to invade the UK. And it is widely acknowledged as one of Churchill's greatest successes during his career.
They must now know that the stakes for which they have decided to play are mortal.
The war dragged on, and with limited British resources, but Hitler making advances through the rest of Europe. Winston Churchill had been trying for many months to involve the USA and to work with U.S. President Roosevelt. Though the U.S. was most determined to remain neutral, they set about finding ways in which to help the U.K. Roosevelt and Churchill eventually met off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941 and created the Atlantic Charter, detailing the aims of the two democracies and their ideas and vision for the world after the war. This journey was fraught with risk, and Churchill's loyal detective, responsible for keeping him alive no matter what, recalls in his own biography the courage and fortitude displayed by Churchill, facing German U-boats and assassination attempts just to cross the North Atlantic and meet with President Roosevelt to seal their strategic alliance.
Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
In December 1941, the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the next day, war was declared on Japan. Their allies, Germany and Italy, then declared war on the U.S. It was time for Britain and the U.S. to fight together.
Where Mr. Churchill returned after his third meeting with America's great statesman and leader, President Roosevelt, where secret plans were made. Yes, plans which will hasten the day when British and American armies will march into countries not as invaders but as liberators.
The Allied war strategy was closely developed and agreed upon between Churchill, Roosevelt, and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin.
The enemy is still proud and powerful. War is full of mysteries and surprises. By singleness of purpose, by steadfastness of conduct, by tenacity and endurance, such as we have so far displayed, by these and only by these can we discharge our duty to the future of the world and to the destiny of man.
After many arduous years, the combined war effort was a success. Britain and its allies stopped Hitler, and the war in Europe ended when Germany surrendered.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
VE Day was a time for great celebration, and parties ran late into the night. It is said that the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret disguised themselves to join the street parties and celebrations, only returning to the safety of Buckingham Palace in the early hours of the next day. Her Majesty openly admitted to sneaking out the back door of Buckingham Palace to join the celebrations, and hiding her face under her army hat to avoid recognition.
Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Britain's first general election in 10 years. All over England, in city and hamlet, the polls are open to elect a new parliament and determine who will be Britain's next prime minister. Sir Archibald Sinclair of the Liberals, the Labour Party's Clement Attlee, or Winston Churchill, nominal leader of the Conservatives.
Sir Winston Churchill achieved international respect and a reputation as a wartime hero after victory in World War II. But the time quickly came when party politics returned, and Churchill's campaigns, whilst met with much excitement and cheering, reflected the war hero, not the political leader.
Britain was a world power. When statesmen like Winston Churchill talked, nations listened.
After so many years of hardship throughout the war, the British public decided they wanted a brighter-looking future, and the promises made by Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party, held much promise.
But the defeat of his Conservative Party in the 1945 elections caused Sir Winston to retire as head of state to lead the opposition party in the House of Commons.
He spent a great deal of time in the south of France, turning to his creativity for solace and focusing on painting, writing, and bricklaying. Following World War II, he made another of his famous speeches in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, by invitation of U.S. President Truman, detailing his concern about the Soviet Union and the efforts to separate the East and West.
It is my duty to place before you certain facts about the present position in Europe. from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The Cold War quickly followed.
Goes to the polls, hoping his Conservative Party will be voted back to power.
After 5 years in the wilderness of opposition politics, Churchill became Prime Minister once again in 1951.
6 years later, public sentiment at the polls was to return the Conservative Party to power, and once again the honored statesman stepped up to the highest executive post in the empire.
It was only 3 months into his second term as Premier when, to the devastation of many, King George VI died. It is said that although Churchill and King George VI were something of polar opposites, King George, a gentle, shy soul, and Churchill, a lively, formidable character, had over time become very close, much of which was likely due to the camaraderie and mutual support during the wartime effort. They became confidants and close friends. Churchill had supported and served his monarch and fulfilled his duty assiduously. King George VI had been struggling for some time with his health and had undergone lung surgery.
The king was gravely ill, and even as we watched and waited, the nation prayed. Operation on the king, we read, and knew how ill he was. But success seemed to crown the skill of the surgeon. But now the king is dead. It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the king's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy. It was her own decision to return at once to London. Long live the Queen! The rulers of our land meet to welcome the new Queen. There too, the Duke of Gloucester, her uncle, and the Lord Chancellor. The Premier and Mr. Attlee, leader of the opposition, are agreed in this great moment of our history. Her tour of the Commonwealth cancelled. The princess we knew as a girl and watched in the even growth of her stature comes back to meet her ministers as queen over the great lands that for 15 years acknowledged her father as head. Now the Princess Elizabeth we knew and loved returns amongst us as our queen. Before her plane, her government and leaders of the other parties receive her greeting. No queen had ever such counselors so predetermined to give of their best. No queen had ever such a people so devoted. Through the long years, she had grown amongst us, one of us. The little girl we knew has become Queen Elizabeth. The love we gave her has become allegiance.
Behind the gates of Sandringham, from the parish church, the coffin was put onto the gun carriage, and the impressively simple cortege began the slow procession to the station. Its men reverently transferred the coffin into the funeral coach of the train.
Through the London streets, where so often the eager crowds had cheered, the procession wends its silent way. This is London's day of mourning.
Oblivious of rain and chilling wind, their presence was the tribute they could pay to him.
It is said that Churchill took this death very badly, and that those around him did not realize the extent to which he felt great sadness for the loss of the monarch. Another bout of depression followed, which may have influenced Winston during his early days as the Queen's first Prime Minister.
And now the Palace of St. James, the center of the Commonwealth, London. The heralds come out, the court officials of Great Britain. Watching is the man who has shaped so much of our destiny. Here, with the Earl Marshal of England, the Duke of Norfolk watching, the ancient formula is carried out. The sovereign-to-be is proclaimed by Garter, King-at-Arms.
In his grief, Churchill initially showed little enthusiasm to work with the young Queen Elizabeth, referring to her as only a child whom he barely knew.
By whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, we therefore, the lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, being here assisted.
However, this quickly changed, and it is thought that he then took it upon himself to honor his dear old friend and make sure Elizabeth knew her role, her responsibilities, and her duty as sovereign, and to make certain he offered her every possible support.
Hers by right of succession, the Princess Elizabeth has agreed to accept the crown and rule as Queen.
Churchill is said to have had a very romanticized view of the monarchy and had a real belief of the importance of their role within society, passionately supporting the notion of the constitutional monarchy. In recognition of his devoted service, King George VI had offered Churchill the Order of the Garter, but Churchill had refused it, as he had just been defeated in the election. However, shortly before the coronation, Queen Elizabeth offered it to him again in April 1953, and as he was at that time, the Prime Minister accepted. The Order of the Garter is the most senior order of knighthood in the British honours system, outranked only by the Victoria Cross and the George Cross, and only awarded to the most distinguished and genuinely deserving. Also, in 1953, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, following the publication of his series of books on the events of World War II and his sea of other historical and journalistic publications. It is often said that great creative minds are the incubator for mental illness. Winston Churchill's infamous bouts of depression, which he called the Black Dog, were said to have affected him for much of his adult life. It is widely believed that his working relationship with Her Majesty served to lift his spirits and to see him through some of his darkest hours. Of course, he was also a prolific painter, and his many works of art and his dedication to writing are also credited with helping him keep depression at bay. The Queen's coronation on 2nd June 1953 was perhaps one of the greatest and most memorable events of the century. There was, however, a bone of contention between Churchill and the Queen. These being the early days of television and mass communication, Her Majesty and Prince Philip felt it important to televise the event live for all to see, while Churchill felt this would be most unfitting and it would allow the ordinary people to get too close to the mystique of their monarch. The Queen prevailed, and the momentous event was broadcast live on television to the nation and relayed to other parts of the Empire and Commonwealth. The world shared in the pomp and grandiosity of the ceremony and celebrated the coronation of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Churchill's entrance to the occasion cemented Winston's position as a beloved national treasure, as he waited to be almost the last to arrive, waving royally to the cheering crowds. Churchill's daughter Mary is reported to have said that the Queen had quickly captivated him, and he had acknowledged her immense sense of duty. Churchill was, of course, born during the reign of Queen Victoria. So when Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, it is said he was thrilled to once again sing the national anthem as God Save the Queen. Years before, in 1947, the Queen had married Prince Philip, then known by his newly adopted surname Philip Mountbatten, that of his uncle Lord Mountbatten. Needless to say, it is common for a woman to take the surname of her husband and for their descendants also to share that surname. Lord Mountbatten then declared it was the House of Mountbatten that reigned. However, when Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth's grandmother, heard of the plan, she spoke with Churchill, and they agreed that it must remain the House of Windsor. Queen Elizabeth agreed and issued a royal proclamation declaring such. Famously, Prince Philip was aggrieved by this and said, "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." Another alleged small rift grew between Churchill, the Queen, and Prince Philip. Buckingham Palace is the official London residence of the sovereign, and Churchill insisted that the Queen and Prince Philip move in immediately. This caused some considerable dismay to the royal couple, as they had put a great deal of time and effort into creating a home for themselves at Clarence House. There was, reportedly, significant pushback and upset, but they eventually agreed and moved into Buckingham Palace, reputed at the time to be cold, drafty, and damp. 3 weeks after the coronation, Churchill's health went into rapid decline. He had a sudden and significant stroke, causing partial paralysis. He was taken back to his home, Chartwell, and given time to recover. However, this was kept secret from the House of Commons and from the Queen. They were told he was suffering from exhaustion, but the truth was revealed a year later, much to the surprise of them all. King George VI had been trying to persuade Winston to retire, as he and his wife were concerned over Winston's health. Ironically, the king's death and the introduction of the new monarch gave Churchill reason to maintain some degree of continuity. The ill health of Churchill's successor, Anthony Eden, was another reason for Winston to carry on. Eden had had an abdominal operation that didn't go quite to plan. So, Churchill remained in place as Prime Minister.
The late King's daughter became England's second Queen Elizabeth. Carefully reared to her responsibilities, she has already captured the affections of Britons during her short reign.
For both of them, the Queen's weekly meetings with her Prime Minister became a pleasure rather than a chore, and it is widely reported that a healthy mutual respect grew between them, underpinned by mutual admiration for the ways in which they both discharged their duties to the country.
Queen Elizabeth visited her North American realm for the first time since ascending the throne.
As ever, the Prime Minister's audience with the monarch is kept absolutely confidential. They meet once a week, every week, and there is no record kept of anything said during these meetings. It is just the Queen and the Prime Minister, with no witnesses, no recordings or minutes taken. However, those waiting outside, whilst unable to hear the exact details of their conversations, have told of times when they would hear roaring laughter coming from the room. Churchill would often emerge from their audience, wiping his eyes from tears of laughter and chuckling to himself as he made his way back to the cut and thrust of the political world. As a young and inexperienced queen, and with Churchill being her first prime minister, it is said that he coached her thoroughly in the complexities and intricacies of British politics, the Constitution, and the government.
The royal couple proceeded up Broadway, the Canyon of Heroes, bombarded by tons of ticker tape, millions of cheers, in what was the most enthusiastic reception anywhere in Elizabeth's 10-day North American tour.
With his many years' experience of wisdom and diplomacy, it is thought that the Queen was enormously grateful for his knowledge and guidance, particularly during those early years as she found her feet, determined to keep her promise of devoting her life to her duties to her people. Of course, she had not grown up expecting to be queen, but merely the king's niece. However, her father, King George VI, became king following his brother's abdication and when he was thought to have a long life ahead of him.
His was the first voluntary abdication in 1,000 years of British history, an abdication he explained to his far-flung empire in the most dramatic and heart-rending farewell ever broadcast.
Believe me,
when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
It was initially thought likely the young Princess Elizabeth would not need to take the role of the monarch for quite some time, so there would be many years ahead for her to prepare for the role, learning from her father and the palace courtiers and advisors. Alas, her father's early demise thrust her into the leading role at a very early age. Over time, Churchill and his queen grew closer and developed an enduring friendship. His respect and appreciation for the monarchy only grew, and it is believed that the Queen held great affection and fondness for Winston.
Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline, London, April 5th, 1955. In a moment, the story.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am now nearing the end of my journey. I hope I still have some services to render.
But in 1955, the advance of time did to Churchill what dictators' armies and warplanes had failed to do. He chose to surrender. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip attended a formal dinner party at the venerable statesman's residence at 10 Downing Street. Sir Winston had announced retirement at the age of 81, an inspirational life of public service that had...
Churchill resigned as Prime Minister in 1955, though he remained a member of Parliament for several years thereafter. With advancing years and in poor health, he was past his prime, and during those last few years, much of his work had been conducted from his bedside. During his illness, Queen Elizabeth wrote a letter to Churchill stating that no prime minister would be able to hold the place of my first prime minister, to whom both my husband and I owe so much, and for whose wise guidance during the early years of my reign I shall always be so profoundly grateful.
This great parliamentary institution, the Palace of Westminster, is going to miss Winston Churchill perhaps more than it's missed any other previous parliamentarian. He has been a great Parliament man. He loved the place, and the place loved him.
Churchill described the Queen as understanding her duties as a sovereign by instinct, and of fulfilling her duties in exemplary fashion. Both publicly and privately, he heaped praise for the work she was doing. Churchill continued as an MP until the general election in 1964.
And I know was capable of satire, a bit of a joke at the expense of his friends and colleagues, but always in such a witty way that even if the victim, if he'd have been there, could not but have enjoyed it. I remember Stafford Cripps coming to the cabinet while he was Minister of Aircraft Production, stated his case, answered questions, and when it was up, finished, stood up, erect, confident that he was right, and as he went out, as he passed the cabinet door, Winston said, "Ha ha, there but for the grace of God goes God."
Winston Churchill died on 24th January 1965, aged 90, following another stroke. Plans for Churchill's funeral, known as Operation Hope Not, were put into action. Protocol dictates the Queen should be the last person to arrive at any function, but the Queen chose to break with tradition on this occasion, and she arrived before his family. They were then asked to join the Queen. This was an extraordinarily sad occasion for so many. The loss of a true statesman, a veritable and courageous war hero, and the most admired and revered leader of the time. Tens of thousands gathered and waited in line to pay their respects. It had been decided that he would have a state funeral, a very rare occurrence, usually reserved for royalty and people of very great significance. Churchill was undoubtedly one of the most renowned political figures and leaders of all time. With such a reputation, it was clear that there was a great sense of mourning around the nation upon his death. That ability to communicate clearly and passionately served Churchill well as a revered orator, a popular author, and a most persuasive statesman. In a 2002 BBC poll, Winston Churchill was voted the greatest Briton ever, mainly for his efforts during the Second World War. To Her Majesty, the Queen, Sir Winston Churchill will always be her first Prime Minister.